And good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. This is video number 12 in our review and response to the book by my friend Steve Gregg entitled, Why Not Full Preterism? And over the last 3 or 4 videos, we've been examining Steve's attempt to negate the time statements concerning the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection. And what has been and continues to me to be the case, at least in my estimation, is that Steve readily admits to the time statements in some context. But then in other contexts, which use the same language, the same verbal, passages or verbal similarities, Steve goes, oh, no, that can't be the same thing. Now, a classic example of that, is found, and this will be a little bit of a reiteration to what we saw last Friday, by the way. I'm going to try to conclude our study of Steve's discussion of the time statements in today's video so that we can move on to different elements of his book. And, it's like I've told you, I'm not going to try to address every single thing that I would take issue with in Steve's book. The book is 300 and some pages long, and so it would be almost an endless type of series of videos in order to address everything. But let me make this observation. If it is true that the time statements found in the New Testament present to us a consistent, harmonious, united testimony, if all of the imminent time statements concerning the day of the Lord, concerning the judgment, concerning the end of the age, concerning the resurrection, if all of those time statements that are related to those issues, if they can be taken at face value, and one of the things that Steve does is twofold. Commenting on 1 Peter chapter 4, Steve says, when Peter says the end of all things is drawn near, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7, Steve says, well, let's put it like this. If Peter was actually predicting the end of time, then he was clearly wrong. Well, wait a minute. As I've suggested to you before, Steve is constantly, throughout the book, inserting his presuppositional view of the last days, the day of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, into text and saying, well, this passage cannot be speaking about Christ's final coming because it says that what it was talking about was near. So near can't mean near if it's talking about the coming of the Lord that Steve puts in our future. Folks, that's a classic example, a petitio principii that says, I'm going to make an assertion here. I'm not going to prove it. I'm going to take it for granted that it's true. And because I take it for granted that it's true, then this other view is therefore wrong. Sorry, that has no real probative value. Another thing that Steve does, in addition to saying, well, okay, if the New Testament writers were actually predicting that the end of the time was near, then they were clearly wrong. Well, obviously, I would agree with that. If the New Testament writers were in fact predicting the end of time to come in their generation, no question about it, they were wrong. Let's face it. End of time didn't happen in the first century, did it? Look, it is this issue that has led scholars and laymen alike to say, Jesus said he was coming back in the first century. He didn't come back in the first century. Therefore, Jesus is a liar. Now, I've mentioned to you, coming up April the 12th, I'll be having a formal 2-hour internet debate with Mr. Mark Smith. Mr. Smith describes himself as a longtime minister in the churches of Christ. He read the New Testament statements about when the Lord's apostles said the end was going to be. Mr. Smith assumed, just like Steve Gregg does, that Jesus, in some of those passages, Mr. Smith says all of them, but in some of those passages, Jesus was talking about the end of time, the end of the Christian age, Jesus coming out of heaven as a 5'5" Jewish man. Mr. Smith said he didn't do it. Jesus therefore lied, or he failed. He was a false teacher and a liar. He's to be rejected. The Bible is to be thrown in the trash. Mr. Smith is now an atheist. And so I'll be having a formal internet debate with him April the 12th on the program called Myth Vision, M-Y-T-H, Vision, that is hosted by Derek Lambert, a former preterist who is now an atheist. So, the power of these statements and the importance for Steve Gregg to negate the time statements. You see, Mr. Smith understood very, very well, and he's written a book entitled Broken Promises, in which he documents the meaning of those New Testament words, the definitions, utterly, totally falsifying all attempts to negate the genuine temporal imminence of the words, like men such as Sam Frost, who told me in an email or in a Facebook exchange, there are no New Testament passages, eschatological passages, that indicate objective nearness. Not one, he said. Well, I'm going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that is the height of absurdity. It is absolutely, totally ridiculous. It's beyond the pale. Men like Mr. Smith understood that. But Mr. Smith has no concept of Hebraic apocalyptic language. So then we come to men like my friend Steve Gregg. He understands Hebraic apocalyptic language in some text is being used metaphorically of Christ's coming and his Father's coming in the Old Testament by using this nation to judge that nation. And that brings us to Matthew 16, 27 and 28. And again, this will be a little bit repetitious from last week, but I want to drive this point home. In Matthew 16, 27 and 28, Jesus said, "The Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels, and shall reward every man according to his works. And verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Steve Gregg says, verse 27, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father. That's the end of time. Verse 28 is probably Pentecost. And here's the problem. And by the way, he admits that it might even refer to AD 70. He says, in these two successive verses, and by the way, notice he admits they are successive verses, but in a moment I'll share with you what he does. There appear to be exactly what full preterism needs, i.e., a reference to the final parousia of Christ in judgment, coupled with a clear and specific time text. To my mind, these verses together come closest of any biblical passage to appearing to support a full preterist contention, namely, that the coming of Christ in final judgment is one and the same as the coming of Christ to judge Jerusalem in AD 70. Therefore, an examination of the juxtaposition of these two statements deserves careful consideration or examination. So what does he do? I would suggest to you, as kindly as possible, as respectfully as possible, he doesn't give a close examination. So what does he do? He says, well, now we know that certain passages that talk about the coming of the Lord are talking about historical events. The Lord, the Father, or Jesus using this nation to judge that nation. It's not end of time events. And he says the divine coming may refer in one context to the conquest of Egypt by Assyria, or later by Babylon, and in another to the conquest of Assyria itself by Babylon. It can also refer to the time of the judgment coming on Israel by the Assyrians, etc., etc. The phraseology may even refer to Christ's act of removing the church at Ephesus, or the church at Sardis, both of which occurred, of course, several centuries into the Christian era. I would suggest to you it took place far before that. But then notice what he does. In all these cases, the expression speaks of some temporal judgment or other, and is to be recognized as a mere common figure of speech. The Lord did not leave heaven and come down to earth in any of these cases. His coming refers only to his sending invasion forces to conquer some group or another. Such is seen as a direct judgment from God, no less than was the destruction of Sodom, though by other means. God's temporal judgments, however, are only tokens of the larger commitment that God has to finally judge the world. So what does he do? AD 70, quote, is the type or token of the final judgment coming on the rest of the world, unquote. Did he provide proof for that? Well, he makes the assertion that Paul spoke of the judgment of the Jews, but also of the Gentiles. So what does he do? He inserts a so far 2,000-year gap between the judgment of Israel in AD 70 and the judgment of the Gentiles, without so much as an exegetical attempt to justify that. Oh, it's just, well, we've got the judgment of the Jews, AD 70, we got the judgment of the Gentiles, which hasn't happened. This completely ignores the fact that Paul said that the judgment of the world, oikumene, Acts chapter 17, God has appointed a day in which he is about to judge the world through that man whom he has appointed the judge of all things. He is about to judge the whole world. And yet, Steve takes that as end of time. But Paul says he's about to do it in the first century. But this whole idea of a dichotomization between the judgment of Judaism versus the Gentiles is a completely false, specious dichotomization. But Steve must have that. And by the way, Luke chapter 21, 25, and 26, in describing the judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70, Steve agrees with that, says at that time, that there would be tumult and there would be fear coming on all the nations. Now, if Steve wants to make that refer to the end of time, he's got to divorce it from the day of the Lord judgment of Jerusalem in Luke 21, 20 through 24. So in other words, he would have to insert his so far 2,000-year gap into the end of verse 24 and have verse 25 completely, totally divorced from it, talking about the end of time. All the while acknowledging that the time of the judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70 is described in typical Hebraic, apocalyptic, metaphoric, figurative language. Oh, but wait, he can't allow that in Luke chapter 21 because remember, he's got verses 20 through 24 AD 70. So if, and I emphasize if he shifts gears in verse 25 and following, and has it refer to the, quote, end of time, trying to draw a distinction between the judgment of Israel and the judgment of the nations, well, verse 25 is the judgment of the nations, but in order to make that, to divorce that from AD 70, once again, you have to insert a 2,000-year gap at the end of verse 24. As I've said earlier, this is gapology run amok. Where is the contextual justification? And oh, by the way, Jesus unequivocally said that the cities of Chorazin, Bethsaida, Tyre, and Sidon, and Sodom, Gentile cities, would rise up in the judgment with the first century generation and condemn Israel. Okay? Was Israel judged in the first century? Steve said they were. Well, those pagan cities were going to arise with Israel in that generation in judgment. So if those pagan cities were going to arise with Israel in judgment, then since Israel was judged in that generation, that means the pagan world was judged as well. So you see, Steve's attempts to dichotomize between judgment of Israel and judgment of the nations completely fails. Absolutely, completely fails. But we're not through. Steve draws a distinction between the judgment coming, the historical coming of Christ and the Father in the Old Testament, and I read part of that for you just a few moments ago, the divine coming of the conquest of Egypt by Assyria, later by Babylon, and in another conquest of Assyria itself by Babylon. In another case, it refers to the fall of Babylon to the Medes and the Persians, Isaiah 13. So you see, Steve has all of these as temporal, historical judgments. But then he says, remember that he said, in none of these cases did God come out of heaven. Here I am, page 87. The Lord did not leave heaven and come down to earth in any of these cases. Well, in Micah chapter 1, verse 3, in describing the impending fall of the 10 northern tribes at the hand of the Assyrians, the Lord will come down out of heaven, walk on the tops of the mountains, and the mountains will melt under his feet. David, in describing how Yahweh delivered him from Saul, as Saul chased him all over the countryside of Israel to kill him because of his jealousy, David, in describing God's deliverance of him, said, darkness was under his feet. He rode upon a chariot. He came down, and notice what he says, he was seen. And so once again, Steve's attempt to dichotomize and divorce between the historical judgments in which God acted by saying, well, in none of those instances did God come down. He was never seen, is patently false. And I absolutely love Isaiah chapter 64, verse 1. Oh, that you would rend the heavens. Oh, that you would shake the earth. Oh, that you would come down, that the nations might tremble at your presence. Lord, when you did mighty works for which we did not look, you came down. Came down. Wait a minute. Steve says, Lord never did leave heaven and come to earth in any of these cases. And yet here's the teacher, here's the prophet saying that in passage after passage after passage of the day of the Lord, you came down. The nations shook at your presence. The mountains trembled. The mountains burned with fire as brush burns before the fire. Literally? No. Typical Hebraic apocalyptic language. Now remember, Steve agrees and admits that in all of those cases, the language of imminence of the day of the Lord was true and accurate. But then, of course, Steve tries to say, well, in those cases, It was God acting representatively. But in the New Testament, when we are told about the Lord coming in his, end of time coming, it is the Lord himself. Well, I've already shared with you how the language of God himself acting in judgment through the means of these other nations was common Hebraic, apocalyptic language. He most assuredly did come himself. When the Lord said, after predicting that Judah and Jerusalem would be scattered into all the nations, the Lord said in Ezekiel, I myself will search for you. Oh, does that mean that Yahweh was going to visibly, may I use the term bodily, quote, physically, going to come out of heaven, go into all of these countries and look for the scattered inhabitants of Jerusalem? Now, that's not correct. So this delineation between the temporal, representative coming of the Lord versus the personal is absolutely false. Once again, in those cases, what did God say? It was he that was going to come out of heaven. It was he that was going to walk on the earth. It was he that was going to be seen. But it was he that was going to use this nation to judge another. Look, folks, there is no dichotomy. There is no distinction. There is no divorcement between those old covenant days of the Lord somehow being temporal and historical versus Christ. And let me make this observation. This is so very, very critical. Remember that Steve argues that Matthew 16:27 is the end of time, personal, visible coming of Christ out of heaven with the angels, etc., etc. Well, the point of fact is, Jesus said that coming was going to be, quote, in the glory of the Father. Scholars such as R.T. France, N.T. Wright, and others have made the observation that what Jesus was saying here is that just like the Father came in judgment many times before, I'm going to come in judgment just like the Father did. Okay, well, if Jesus in Matthew 16:27, which Steve applies the end of time, if Jesus said he was going to come as the Father had come, but the Father had never ever come literally, visibly, bodily, and physically, then Jesus in Matthew 16:27, number one, was not saying that he was going to come out of heaven as a 5-foot Jewish man, but he was saying that he was going to come in judgment in the same way the Father had come. And look at John chapter 5:21 and following. From henceforth the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son, that all men might honor the Son as they honor the Father. The Son can do nothing of himself but what he sees the Father do. Let me ask you, how had Jesus seen the Father come in judgment? And was going to come in the way he had seen the Father come? Well, Steve explained it right here, page 86. In the coming of the Lord in the Old Testament, the day of the Lord, Babylon and the Assyrians destroyed Egypt. The Assyrians destroyed the 10 northern tribes. And on it goes. Now, and I'm going to close out with this. Steve goes to Matthew chapter 22 and the great parable of a great man, a king, who made a great wedding feast for his son. he sent out his servants to call those who had already been invited, saying, all things are ready, come to the feast, come to the wedding. Well, those men began to make light of the invitation and to say, well, I just got married. I just can't come. And I've forgotten who it was who made the illustration. Are you telling me that a guy understands what an incredible honor it was to be invited to a wedding, and his wife gets the opportunity to dress up in his finery, and he will not take her? Dumb. Well, I bought a piece of property. I have to go look at it. You bought the piece of property sight unseen? I bought some oxen. Got to go try them out. You bought a set of oxen. You didn't try them out. You see, on the very face of it, the excuses are ridiculous. But those same individuals who begin to make the excuses beat the servants. And so the master of the wedding sent out his army. He killed those wicked servants or wicked men and burnt their city. I really like the way Donald Hagner says it in the Word Biblical Commentary when he says, no one can read this without thinking, or it is impossible to read this and not think of AD 70. Well, I agree. But what does Steve do? Well, he goes to the parable and he says, well, you see, the master of the vineyard sent out servants. After the initial servants were mistreated and they were beaten, he sent out his servants and said, go out into the highways and the byways and compel them to come in, that my wedding feast may be full. And they did. They brought men in. And there's this guy that is not dressed in the proper attire. And the master says, sir, where is your wedding garment? And because he was not properly attired, he was cast out. So what does Steve do? Steve inserts his gapology, exercises it in the fullest extent, and says, well, you see, in verse 7, in the destruction of those men who beat the servants and mistreated them and burnt their city, we have AD 70. But now, we have another judgment at the end of time. Once again, gapology run amok. Folks, where did this idea come from? I know where it came from. It is argumentum ad desperatum. It is a desperate attempt to hold on to a futurist eschatology. Now, here's what's ironic. Steve admits and agrees that the wedding has already taken place. We enjoy the messianic wedding banquet now. So the wedding took place, but we're still waiting for the judgment of those who have come in without the proper wedding attire. Well, according to Luke chapter 13, 28 and following, that when that wedding banquet was set, Jesus said, you, speaking of the Jews, are going to see Abraham and Isaac and Jacob sit down in the kingdom, and you yourselves cast out. Steve takes that, AD 70. Amen. Where do you get another judgment? Where do you get another corporate judgment out of that? It's not there. So I think you can see, and there's a whole lot more that I could talk about. Let me make one final point on Matthew 16, 27 and 28. Have to do this. Steve dichotomizes between verse 27 and verse 28. Verse 27, end of time. Verse 28, AD 70 or Pentecost. That completely ignores the grammar, and especially the Greek grammar. Verse 28 begins with, verily I say unto you. Ladies and gentlemen, this is from the Greek term, amin lego humin, translated as verily I say unto you. It is used many, many, many times in the Gospels, most often on the lips of Jesus. It never introduces a brand new subject. Listen to me. It always calls attention to what is about to be said that is going to emphasize something that's just been said. Well, what does that mean? That means that verse 28 is emphasizing verse 27. How is it emphasizing it? By telling us that verse 27 was going to be fulfilled in that generation, in the lifetime of the audience that was standing there at that very time. Steve has to completely, totally ignore this. He has to completely, totally ignore the grammar in order to hold on to his view. Verse 27, end of time. Verse 28, Pentecost or AD 70. That's not proper exegesis, ladies and gentlemen. I think we have therefore shown pretty effectively that Steve Gregg's attempt to either ignore, to distort, to mitigate, or to redirect even the New Testament time statements of imminence concerning the day of the Lord is completely misguided. And here's what that means. You know, if you don't get anything else here, you have to understand that if the New Testament time statements concerning the time of the judgment of the living and the dead, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 5, 7, and 17, which unequivocally said that the time for that judgment had arrived in the first century. Doesn't matter what your view of 1 Corinthians 15 is. Doesn't matter what your view of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 2 Corinthians chapter 5 is. Really doesn't matter. When we acknowledge the objective nature of those time statements, then all New Testament eschatology has to be viewed through the prism of the first century fulfillment. Thank you for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. You have a safe weekend. I'll see you on Monday.